Imagine a country that loses more than half its territory with a single signature, not to a natural disaster, but to a lost war. California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, pieces of Colorado and Wyoming. All of this was once Mexico. Today it's the heart of the United States. Hollywood, Silicon Valley, the beaches of San Diego, the vineyards of Napa. If you overlay a modern map of the U.S. onto a map of Mexico from 1821, the difference is staggering. Almost half of the current territory of the United States once belonged to its southern neighbor. That's not just a trivia fact. It's a wound that shaped the next century of Mexican history. That we usually talk about the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 as a single textbook event. It started, it ended, a treaty was signed. But the real story is what happened after. How does a country go on after losing half of itself overnight? What happens to its economy when the richest lands end up on the other side of a new border? How does its politics change after the greatest humiliation in its short history of independence? Today we'll trace what happened to Mexico in the decades after 1848. Political chaos, civil war, a French occupation that ended with an executed emperor, and a dictatorship that eventually led to revolution. And we'll see why the consequences of this war are still felt today in Mexican culture, politics, and relations with the U.S. Let's start from the beginning. Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, inheriting a vast but sparsely populated, poorly controlled territory stretching from present-day Texas to California. On paper, it was one of the largest states in the world. In practice, a country of about 7 million people that couldn't be effectively governed from a single center in Mexico City. The young state suffered chronic instability, over 30 changes of government in its first 25 years, as power passed between liberals and conservatives, federalists and centralists, none of them strong enough to build lasting institutions. The presidency itself became something of a revolving door, changing hands through coup after coup. With no reliable mechanism for a peaceful transfer of power, Mexico's northern provinces, including Texas, were thinly settled by Mexicans. In the 1820s, the government allowed mass immigration of American colonists into Texas, hoping they would help develop the empty frontier, a fatal miscalculation. Within years, settlers from the U.S. outnumbered local Mexicans several times over, keeping their own language, culture, and often the slaveholding system Mexico was trying to abolish. Tensions built for a decade, and in 1836 Texas declared independence after a short, bloody war that included the famous Battle of the Alamo, where the entire garrison of defenders was killed. Mexico never formally recognized this, treating Texas as a breakaway province rather than a state. For 9 years Texas existed as an independent republic, until in 1845 the U.S. annexed it outright and admitted it as the 28th state. For Mexico, this was a direct insult. Annexation of territory it still legally considered its own. On top of that came a border dispute. Mexico insisted the boundary was the Nueces River. The U.S. claimed land all the way to the Rio Grande, hundreds of kilometers further south, territory that had never actually been controlled by Texan rebels. President James Polk, driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was fated to span the continent from ocean to ocean, sent troops into the disputed zone. When patrols clashed there in April 1846, Polk had his pretext. He declared that American blood has been shed on American soil, and Congress declared war. The war lasted 2 years and went catastrophically for Mexico. American forces under General Zachary Taylor took northern Mexico, including Monterrey, while another army under Stephen Kearny occupied New Mexico with little resistance. In California, settlers proclaimed a short-lived Bear Flag Republic that was quickly folded into the U.S. The decisive campaign came in the South. General Winfield Scott landed at Veracruz and marched inland toward the capital. In September 1847, after fierce fighting, including the defense of the Chapultepec Military Academy, whose fallen teenage cadets became national martyrs known as the Niños Héroes, the boy heroes, American troops entered Mexico City and raised their flag over the National Palace. It was an unprecedented humiliation. For the first time in the history of independent Mexico, a foreign army had occupied the capital itself. With the government in flight and the country leaderless, the American diplomat Nicholas Trist negotiated a settlement, effectively defying instructions from Washington, since President Polk actually wanted to seize even more territory at that point. On February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in a suburb of the capital. Under its terms, Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as the border with Texas and ceded the vast Mexican cession, comprising today's California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In total, Mexico lost about 55% of its pre-war territory, roughly 1.36 million square kilometers. In exchange, the U.S. paid $15 million and assumed around $3.25 million in debts owed to American citizens, formally a purchase, but in reality a victor's payment to legitimize a conquest already achieved by force of arms. The treaty also promised U.S. citizenship, property protection, and religious rights to the Mexicans who remained on the ceded land. As we'll see, those promises were honored only selectively. Imagine Mexican society in 1848. The country hadn't just lost a war. It had lost almost half its map barely a quarter century after gaining independence. The capital had been occupied, the presidential palace flew a foreign flag, and teenage cadets were mourned as martyrs of a lost battle. The national trauma was immense, and it touched every part of public life. Politically, the country fell into a deep crisis of legitimacy. General Antonio López de Santa Anna, in charge at the moment of defeat and already a six-time president, was thoroughly discredited. Yet this didn't stop him from returning to power for what would be his 10th term in 1853. This alone is telling. Mexico's political system had no stable mechanism for transferring power, and any sufficiently strong elite faction could put even a disgraced leader back in charge. A bitter debate followed immediately after the war. Who was to blame for the defeat? Some pointed to a corrupt and incompetent political and military elite. Others blamed regional separatism and the province's refusal to unite for common defense. Still others argued the real cause lay in the very structure of Mexican society: deep inequality, a weak state, and a population too uneducated and unmobilized to defend the country the way they believed Americans would have. Economically, the picture was bleak. The treasury, already empty before the war, was further drained by the fighting. The $15 million in compensation from the treaty evaporated quickly, absorbed mostly by debts and current expenses rather than any real development. And Mexico had lost an enormous store of future wealth it didn't even know it possessed. Here we arrive at one of the bitterest ironies in this whole story. Just weeks before the treaty was signed, in January 1848, gold was discovered on John Sutter's land in California, at that point still formally Mexican territory, though already under American occupation. News of the find spread slowly. and its true scale only became clear over the following year. The California Gold Rush of 1849 transformed the newly annexed province into one of the richest regions on Earth within just a few years. San Francisco's population exploded from a few hundred people to tens of thousands, and billions of dollars in today's money poured into the region. Mexico received not a single cent of it. Land that Mexican negotiators and public opinion had often dismissed during the talks as a sparsely populated frontier of little value, turned out to be stuffed with gold, and soon with silver in Nevada, oil and copper in Arizona, and the fertile farmland of California's Great Valleys. Mexican newspapers wrote bitterly for years about this lost treasure, and the theme wouldn't disappear from the press or from political speeches for a long time to come. The psychological toll ran just as deep as the economic one. The concept of malinchismo took hold and intensified in Mexican political culture, a term derived from La Malinche, the indigenous woman who served as interpreter and mistress to the conquistador Hernán Cortés, and who is traditionally regarded as a symbol of betraying one's own people for a foreigner. Malinchismo became a kind of national self-distrust, a habit of blaming internal weakness, disunity, and elite betrayal for defeats at the hands of stronger neighbors, paired with a deep ambivalence toward everything foreign, admiration and suspicion at once. From this point on, the United States stopped being merely a powerful neighbor and became, in the Mexican imagination, an existential threat, a perception that would go on to shape Mexican political rhetoric about sovereignty, the border, and trade for generations, right up to today. The human cost of the war was just as real for the people left behind. Roughly 80,000 to 100,000 Mexicans, farmers, ranchers, merchants, officials, remained on the ceded lands and woke up one day as citizens of another country, without moving a single step themselves. The treaty formally promised them U.S. citizenship and protection of property, which looked progressive on paper. In practice, things went very differently. In California, the new American government passed the Land Act of 1851, requiring holders of old Spanish and Mexican land grants, the ranchos, to prove their ownership before a special land commission, often through years of litigation conducted in English, inside an unfamiliar legal system. Many families who had held land for generations either lost their cases over technical defects in old paperwork, or were simply bankrupted by legal fees while trying to defend their claims, and ended up selling their land cheaply to newly arrived American settlers. In Texas, dispossession happened even more violently. Mexican landowners were pushed out through direct force and lynchings that continued for decades. This is how the community historians call Mexican Americans was born across the U.S. Southwest, people who never crossed a border, but whom the border crossed instead. They faced language discrimination and economic marginalization, but they also built and preserved a unique borderland culture with its own cuisine, music, and dialects of Spanish, including what's now known as Spanglish, that remains an inseparable part of the cultural identity of the American West and South. This matters because it shows the war's consequences weren't abstract lines on a map. They were living human fates stretched across generations. And this is where the long history of the Mexican-American community, now numbering in the tens of millions, actually begins. It seemed things couldn't get any worse. But in 1853, Santa Anna, back in power once again and desperate for money to fill an empty treasury and pay for his personal guard, sold the United States yet another slice of territory, about 76,000 square kilometers in what's now southern Arizona and New Mexico. This is the Gadsden Purchase, named for the American envoy James Gadsden, who negotiated it. The official American justification was the need for flat land south of the mountains for a future transcontinental railroad linking the South to California. Mexico received $10 million, a sum Santa Anna largely spent shoring up his own rule rather than developing the country. For a public that already blamed Santa Anna for the catastrophe of 1848, this New Deal was the final straw. Opposition newspapers openly called him a traitor selling off the homeland piece by piece. It was precisely after the Gadsden Purchase that the opposition liberal movement of young lawyers and politicians fully came together, a movement that would overthrow Santa Anna for good in 1855 in an uprising known as the Plan of Ayutla. This purchase permanently fixed the U.S.-Mexico border where it still runs today. Not another square kilometer would ever be lost. The loss of territory and the humiliation of 1848 set off in Mexico a deep and painful process of political reconsideration. A young generation of liberal politicians, lawyers, and intellectuals, the so-called Los Puros, the uncompromising, pure liberals, concluded that the cause of the country's weakness lay not only in American aggression, but above all in Mexico's own internal structure, the excessive political and economic power of a Catholic Church that held enormous, largely untaxed landholdings, military privileges known as fueros that placed soldiers outside civilian courts, a backward agrarian economy, built on giant estates and semi-feudal relations, and a weak, fragmented state that couldn't mobilize its own resources even in the face of external threats. After overthrowing Santa Anna in 1855, the liberals launched a sweeping reform program known to history as La Reforma. The Juárez Law of 1855 stripped the military and clergy of their special courts, placing them under ordinary civil jurisdiction. The Lerdo Law of 1856 forced the church and indigenous communities, the so-called ejidos, to sell land they didn't directly use, an idea meant to create a class of small independent farmers, but which in practice often let wealthy landowners buy up indigenous communal land instead, stripping villages of centuries-old rights. And the Constitution of 1857 crowned this process, establishing a secular, federal state with freedom of speech and the press, the abolition of slavery, and strict limits on church property and privilege. The central figure of this era was Benito Juárez, arguably the single most important figure in 19th-century Mexican history. An ethnic Zapotec from a poor mountain village in Oaxaca who didn't even speak Spanish as a child, he trained as a lawyer, built a political career, and eventually rose to the presidency. His story became deeply woven into Mexican national identity. A man of indigenous origin, risen from poverty to the nation's highest office, leading a country that had recently lost a humiliating war to its white Anglo-Saxon neighbor, and steering it toward modernization and the defense of its sovereignty. The reforms provoked fierce and almost inevitable resistance from conservatives, the church hierarchy, and the military elite, who saw them as a direct threat to centuries of privilege. This erupted into the bloody Civil War of the Reform, 1858 to 1861, during which Juárez's liberal government, pushed out of Mexico City by conservatives, ruled for a time from the port city of Veracruz, financing its resistance through customs revenue. The liberals finally won in January 1861, and Juárez returned triumphantly to the capital. But the country emerged from this internal war utterly exhausted, a wrecked economy, an empty treasury, tens of thousands dead, and, crucially for what comes next, enormous debts to foreign powers that both sides had run up borrowing from British, French, and Spanish creditors to finance the fighting. This legacy of debt would soon become the trigger for the most dramatic chapter yet in Mexican history. In July 1861, unable to pay its accumulated foreign debts, Juárez's government declared a 2-year moratorium on payments to foreign creditors. In response, Spain, Britain, and France sent a joint force to the Mexican port of Veracruz to seize customs revenue by force. The Spanish and British soon realized that French Emperor Napoleon III had far more ambitious plans than simple debt collection, quickly struck a deal with Mexico, and withdrew. The French stayed and revealed their true intentions. With the United States fully absorbed in its own Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and unable to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, the principle by which Washington opposed new European colonial intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Napoleon III saw an opportunity to install a puppet monarchy in Mexico that would counterbalance growing American power in the region. French troops landed at Veracruz and marched inland. On May 5, 1862, at the Battle of Puebla, a small, poorly equipped Mexican force under General Ignacio Zaragoza stunned the French with an unexpected victory. The origin of Cinco de Mayo, a date often misunderstood abroad as Mexico's Independence Day. It isn't. That's September 16th. Nor was it a decisive victory in the wider war. The French soon regrouped with much larger forces and, over the following year, occupied most of the country's major cities, including Mexico City in 1863. Mexico's conservative elite, crushed in the War of the Reform and eager to regain their lost privileges, backed the French plan and invited a European monarch to take the Mexican throne. In 1864, that monarch became Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Habsburg, younger brother of the Austrian emperor, an educated man with relatively liberal views by European standards, who genuinely believed he could bring peace and progress to Mexico under a crown. In one of the war's stranger ironies, Maximilian, once in Mexico, actually implemented reforms strikingly similar to those of Juárez himself, and even refused to repeal parts of the La Reforma legislation, disappointing the conservative patrons who had installed him. But Maximilian's legitimacy rested entirely on French bayonets. Juárez never recognized the new government and kept fighting, retreating with the remnants of the Republican government to the country's north, near the U.S. border, where he held on at the very edge of total defeat. Everything changed once the U.S. Civil War ended in 1865. Washington, concerned about a Monroe Doctrine violation on its doorstep, began actively arming and financing Juárez's Republicans and pressuring Paris to withdraw. Napoleon III, facing domestic troubles and the growing threat of war with Prussia in Europe, decided the Mexican adventure had become too costly, and in 1866 to 1867 pulled French troops out, effectively abandoning Maximilian to his fate. Refusing to flee, Maximilian was captured by Republican forces at Querétaro and, in a sign of just how uncompromising Mexican politics had become after decades of internal war, sentenced to death. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian of Habsburg was executed by firing squad alongside 2 of his Mexican generals, despite clemency appeals from monarchs across Europe. The scene would later become the subject of a famous series of paintings by the French artist Edouard Manet. This episode is crucial to our story because it demonstrates, almost like a textbook case, a direct chain of cause and effect. The territorial defeat of 1848 weakened the Mexican state economically and politically. The weakened state fell deep into debt fighting its own internal wars, and the inability to repay that debt became the pretext for direct foreign invasion and occupation. A Mexico cut in half, impoverished, and divided had become, within barely 20 years of losing half its territory, easy prey for any outside power willing and able to intervene by force. Juárez, restored to power in a liberated country, governed until his death in 1872, remembered ever since as a symbol of the unyielding defense of national sovereignty. Real, lasting stability of a very different kind came only after him, with the rise of General Porfirio Díaz, a veteran of the fight against the French occupation and once a comrade of Juárez himself, who seized power in 1876 and ruled almost continuously, with one brief formal interruption, until 1911. 34 years under one man. The era known as the Porfiriato. Díaz built an authoritarian but remarkably stable regime under the slogan "Order and Progress," borrowed from the positivist philosophy fashionable among the technocratic intellectuals, the so-called scientificos, who surrounded him and believed the country should be governed rationally, through scientific progress, even at the cost of democratic freedoms. Foreign capital poured in, American, British, and French, funding a railway network that grew from a few hundred kilometers to more than 19,000, along with booming mining, oil extraction, and exports of silver, rubber, and textiles. Mexico City filled with monumental European-style architecture, electric lighting, telegraph lines, and the first automobiles. On paper, it looked like a genuine economic miracle, but behind this facade of modernization lay an extraordinarily high social cost. Land rapidly concentrated in the hands of a narrow oligarchic elite, foreign companies, and Díaz's personal associates. By the end of the Porfiriato, over 90% of Mexico's rural population was effectively landless, while fewer than 1,000 families controlled most of the country's farmland. Millions of peasants, including descendants of indigenous communities whose communal lands had been sold off since the days of the Lerdo Law, became effectively indentured laborers, bound by debt to enormous estates called haciendas. Political freedoms were systematically crushed, elections became a farce, the press was censored, and any real opposition was ruthlessly suppressed. There's a bitter irony here. A man who once fought French occupiers and championed the liberal freedoms of La Reforma ended his own long rule as the very kind of dictator who blocked the democratization he'd once fought for. It was this deep inequality, built up over decades of the Porfiriato, that would trigger the next great upheaval in Mexican history. The Mexican Revolution, which erupted in 1910 and claimed the lives of at least 1 million Mexicans. A much longer story, deserving of its own video. For our purposes, what matters is the direct historical thread running through all of it. The trauma of 1848 and the decades of turmoil that followed, La Reforma, the War of the Reform, the French occupation, taught the Mexican elite that survival in the shadow of a powerful northern neighbor depended on modernization at any cost. Even when that modernization meant a new kind of dependency, no longer territorial, but now economic, on foreign, mostly American capital, it seemed the lesser evil next to the risk of another military defeat or internal chaos. What remains of all this today, nearly 180 years later. First, there's the demographic legacy we've already traced. Tens of millions of Mexicans and Americans of Mexican descent now live on land that was once Mexico. The Mexican-American community, whose ancestors became foreigners on their own soil overnight. faced discrimination, land dispossession, and cultural marginalization, yet ultimately became one of the largest and most influential ethnic communities in the modern United States, stretching from California to Texas. Second, there's a psychological and cultural imprint that has proven remarkably durable. The line often attributed to Porfirio Díaz, that poor Mexico lies too far from God and too close to the United States, has become practically a national aphorism, still quoted by Mexican politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens whenever they discuss the deeply asymmetric relationship between the two countries. Third, this history has shaped all of Mexico's later foreign and domestic policy. A chronic wariness about national sovereignty, heightened sensitivity to any hint of foreign interference in internal affairs, and skepticism toward overly close economic integration with the U.S. These sentiments run through the Mexican Constitution of 1917, adopted after the Revolution, with its strict limits on foreign ownership of land and natural resources, and they still surface today in debates over trade agreements, the border wall, and migration between the two countries. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, the very structure of inequality that formed as Mexico tried to catch up with the United States through the Porfiriato's authoritarian modernization ultimately fed directly into the Mexican Revolution of 1910, the greatest social upheaval in Latin American history up to that point, one that would define the face of Mexican state and society throughout the entire 20th century. The Mexican-American War lasted only 2 years, but its consequences, deep political instability, radical liberal reform, a bloody civil war, a foreign monarchical intervention that ended with an executed emperor, and finally an authoritarian modernization that eventually broke under the weight of its own contradictions, stretched across decades, and, without exaggeration, shaped the Mexico we know today. This is a story about how a single defeat can alter the fate of an entire people, not all at once, but wave after wave, generation after generation. It's a story about how thin the line really is between territory and the fate of millions of people. Every border drawn on a map by diplomats and generals goes on shaping the lives of the descendants of those who ended up on one side of it or the other, even a century and a half later. And perhaps most importantly of all, the history of Mexico after 1848 is a reminder that for any nation, the real test doesn't come at the moment of defeat, but in the long decades that follow, when a people must decide who they are, when the easiest path is to blame someone else, and the hardest, but the only truly effective one, is to re-examine themselves. If you found this interesting, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what topic from Latin American history you'd like us to cover next. Maybe the Mexican Revolution itself, the story of the Mexican-American community in the U.S., or the fate of the last indigenous empires before the arrival of the Spanish. Thanks for watching this video all the way through. See you in the next one.